Have you ever looked at your bank account and quietly wondered why building wealth feels so incredibly difficult? It can feel like you're pushing a massive boulder uphill, except you're wearing roller skates. Every step forward takes effort, discipline, and restraint. And yet, the moment you lose focus, you slide backward faster than you progressed. This isn't just your imagination. It's not because you lack intelligence, opportunity, or ambition. In fact, the early stage of building wealth is inherently difficult by design. When you're starting from nothing, every dollar you save comes directly from your own effort. There's no system supporting you yet. No momentum. No leverage. That's why progress feels slow, painfully slow. But here's the part most people don't realize. The game changes completely once you reach a certain point. There is a threshold, one that many investors and entrepreneurs quietly acknowledge, where building wealth stops feeling like constant resistance and starts feeling almost effortless. That threshold is your first $100,000. And once you reach it, everything begins to shift in your favor. In this breakdown, we're going to go far beyond surface-level financial advice. You're not just going to hear that saving money is important or investing is good. You've heard that before. It doesn't change anything. Instead, you're going to understand why the first $100,000 feels so painfully difficult to achieve, both mathematically and psychologically. You'll see why progress feels invisible in the beginning, and why so many people give up long before they ever gain momentum. More importantly, you'll discover why the next $100,000 becomes dramatically easier, not because of luck, and not because rich people have secret advantages, but because the underlying rules of the game begin to change. And finally, you'll walk away with a clear, practical framework you can actually apply, starting from wherever you are right now, to move toward that first major milestone faster and more strategically. Because once you truly understand how wealth building actually works, you stop fighting against the system, and you start working with it. At the beginning of your wealth building journey, the math is not on your side, and that's the part most people underestimate. When you're starting from zero, there is no hidden force helping you grow, no compounding engine quietly working in the background. Every dollar in your account exists because you put it there. Your income, your discipline, and your ability to spend less than you earn are doing 100% of the work. This is what can be called the manual labor phase of wealth building. Imagine trying to fill a large swimming pool using nothing but a small garden hose. The water is flowing, but the progress is almost invisible. Now imagine there's a slow leak at the bottom of the pool, small but constant. That leak represents your everyday expenses, impulses, and lifestyle habits. Even if you're doing everything right, it still feels like you're barely moving forward. Let's make this more concrete. Say you've managed to save and invest $5,000. That's already more discipline than most people have. Now assume you earn a solid 10% annual return. After 1 year, you've made $500. That's not nothing, but it's also not life-changing. In fact, it's small enough that it can feel almost pointless. You could earn that amount by picking up a few extra shifts, doing freelance work, or selling things you no longer use. And because the result feels so minor compared to the effort, many people start to question the entire strategy. They begin to think, is this even worth it? And that's where the biggest mistake happens. They give up, not because the strategy is wrong, but because the timeline doesn't match their expectations. What they fail to realize is this. At low levels of capital, returns are supposed to feel small. That's not a flaw in the system. It's the system working exactly as intended. But everything changes when the numbers get bigger. Fast forward to the point where you've accumulated $100,000. Now apply that same 10% return. Suddenly, you're generating $10,000 per year, not from your job, not from extra effort, but from your existing capital. Now the dynamic has shifted. Your money is no longer passive, it's active, it's contributing in a meaningful way, it's starting to share the workload. And for the first time, wealth building stops feeling like pure effort and starts feeling like progress. At this stage, it's important to understand something that often gets misunderstood. Compound interest is not weak. It only appears weak because most people never stay in the game long enough or build enough capital to experience its real power. In the early phase, compounding feels almost invisible. Your returns are small, slow, and easy to ignore. There's no excitement, no dramatic growth, just incremental progress that doesn't seem to justify the effort. But beneath the surface, something critical is happening. Every dollar you invest is not just sitting there, it's becoming a future worker. And over time, those workers begin to multiply. Think of it like rolling a snowball down a hill. At the very beginning, the snowball is small. You have to push it manually and it barely picks up any snow. It's frustrating. It feels inefficient. You might even question whether it's worth continuing. But if you keep pushing, consistently, patiently, the snowball starts to grow. And then at a certain point, something shifts. The snowball becomes large enough that it starts rolling on its own. It picks up more snow with less effort. Its growth becomes visible, then noticeable, and eventually undeniable. That moment, that transition from manual effort to self-sustaining growth, is exactly what happens when you approach and surpass your first $100,000. From there, your returns begin to generate meaningful income. Your progress becomes easier to see. Your motivation increases naturally. And most importantly, the system starts working for you instead of requiring constant force from you. This is the turning point that separates those who struggle forever from those who begin to accelerate. The tragedy is that most people quit just before they reach it. If wealth building were purely about math, almost everyone would succeed. The formulas are simple. The principles are widely available. You don't need a high IQ or insider knowledge to understand how money grows. And yet, most people never reach their first $100,000. Why? Because the real obstacle isn't mathematics. It's psychology. We live in a world designed around immediacy. You can order food and have it delivered within minutes. You can stream any movie instantly. You can receive validation, entertainment, and stimulation on demand. Everything is fast. Everything is now. And that creates a dangerous mismatch when it comes to building wealth. Because wealth requires the opposite. Delayed gratification, long-term thinking, consistent discipline without immediate reward. This is where most people break. Choosing to save and invest money means saying no to things that provide instant pleasure. It means skipping the expensive dinner, delaying the new purchase, or resisting the urge to upgrade your lifestyle just because you can. And those decisions don't feel good in the moment. In fact, they often feel like you're missing out. This leads to what can be called the lifestyle trap. Individually, small expenses don't seem harmful. A daily coffee, food delivery a few times a week, subscriptions you barely notice. None of these decisions feel significant on their own. But over time they compound, just like investments do, but in the opposite direction. Instead of building wealth, they quietly erode your ability to accumulate it. And here's the uncomfortable truth. It's rarely one big mistake that keeps people stuck. It's hundreds of small, unconscious decisions repeated daily. Even more challenging is the social pressure. When you start becoming intentional with money, spending less, saving more, thinking long-term, people around you may not understand. They might say you're being too extreme, that you should enjoy life, or that money isn't everything. But what they're really reacting to is change. Your discipline highlights their lack of it. Your long-term thinking contrasts with their short-term habits, and that can be uncomfortable for them. So they push back, often without realizing it. To move forward, you have to develop the ability to stay focused despite that noise. Because in the end, the battle isn't between you and the market. It's between you and your own impulses. By now, it should be clear that reaching your first $100,000 is not just a financial challenge, it's a behavioral one. And this is exactly where most people fall short. The first reason is simple: limited income in the early years. When you're just starting out, your earning power is often at its lowest. Entry-level salaries, rising living costs, and financial responsibilities leave very little room to save. Even with good intentions, the margin between what you earn and what you spend can feel almost non-existent. But low income alone isn't the real problem. The deeper issue is what people do with the income they have. This leads to the second reason: lifestyle inflation. As income increases, even slightly, expenses tend to rise alongside it. A small raise turns into a slightly nicer apartment. A bonus turns into a new phone. A promotion becomes justification for a more expensive car. Instead of widening the gap between income and expenses, most people keep that gap exactly the same. Or worse, they eliminate it entirely. And without that gap, wealth building becomes impossible. The third reason is impatience. In the early stages, progress is slow and often invisible. You can do everything right for months or even years and still feel like nothing is changing. That lack of visible reward is dangerous. Because humans are wired to respond to feedback. When we don't see results, we assume our efforts aren't working. We lose motivation. We start looking for shortcuts, faster methods, or easier paths. And eventually, many people give up. Not because they couldn't succeed, but because they didn't stay consistent long enough to see the system work. Finally, there's a hidden factor that doesn't get talked about enough: lack of clarity. Many people say they want to be rich or have more money, but they don't have a clear target, a defined strategy, or a measurable plan. Without direction, even the best intentions fade over time. Saving becomes optional, investing becomes inconsistent, progress becomes random. And random effort rarely leads to meaningful results. So when you combine limited income, rising expenses, lack of patience, and unclear direction, it becomes obvious why so few people ever reach that first major milestone. But the good news is this: none of these obstacles are permanent. They can all be addressed if you're willing to approach the problem differently. At this point, the question is no longer why the first $100,000 is difficult. The real question becomes, how do you actually get there? And the answer is far less complicated than most people expect. It does not require complex investing strategies, insider knowledge, or perfect timing. In fact, the biggest misconception in personal finance is that success comes from finding a secret strategy. It doesn't. It comes from a simple but extremely difficult principle. Maximize the gap between what you earn and what you spend, and consistently invest the difference. Everything else is secondary. The first step is awareness. Most people don't actually know where their money goes. They believe they have a general idea, but when they track every expense for a full month, reality often looks very different from perception. Small purchases accumulate quietly. Food delivery, subscriptions, impulse buys, convenience spending. Individually, they feel harmless. Collectively, they shape your entire financial trajectory. Once you see the truth clearly, the second step becomes possible: control. But control does not mean deprivation. It does not mean eliminating everything enjoyable from your life. That approach is not sustainable, and it usually leads to burnout. Instead, it means distinction. You begin to separate spending into two categories: spending that brings real, intentional value, spending that exists purely out of habit or convenience. The goal is not to eliminate joy, but to eliminate unconscious behavior. You keep what you truly value. You remove what you don't even notice. The third step is income expansion. Many people assume their salary is fixed and unchangeable, but in reality, income is one of the most flexible components of wealth building. In today's world, there are multiple ways to increase earnings: developing new skills, freelancing, building side income streams, leveraging online platforms, creating value beyond your primary job. This is not about working endlessly. It is about expanding options. Because the wider the gap between income and expenses becomes, the faster capital begins to accumulate. And once capital accumulates, everything changes. To make this concrete, consider a simple scenario. If someone consistently saves and invests around $2,000 per month and earns an average return of 8% annually, reaching $100,000 is not a distant dream. It becomes a structured timeline of a few years. The math is not the limiting factor. The limiting factor is consistency. Most people do not fail because the system doesn't work. They fail because they cannot maintain the behavior required for long enough. And that is the real strategy. Not perfection, not speed, but persistence. Reaching your first $100,000 is not just a financial milestone. It is a psychological shift. Because at that point, something subtle but extremely important begins to change: your relationship with money. Before this point, money feels like something you constantly chase. Every dollar requires effort. Every gain feels small. Progress is slow and often invisible. But once you cross that threshold, the structure changes. Your money begins to generate noticeable returns on its own. Even conservative investments start producing results that you can actually feel. A few $1,000s in growth, noticeable account fluctuations, returns that begin to matter in your monthly or yearly perspective. And this changes how you think. You no longer see investing as something abstract or theoretical. You see it working in real time. This is where wealth momentum begins. Momentum is not just financial, it is behavioral. When you see consistent progress, even small, your motivation increases. You become more intentional with decisions. You start paying attention to opportunities you previously ignored. You begin to think in longer time horizons. And perhaps most importantly, you gain confidence. Because now you have proof, not theory, that you can accumulate wealth. That confidence changes your risk tolerance. Before $100,000, financial risk feels dangerous. A small loss feels significant. A bad decision feels catastrophic. But after $100,000, perspective shifts. You begin to understand volatility. You realize that fluctuations are normal. You stop reacting emotionally to short-term changes and start focusing on long-term trends. This emotional stability is one of the most underrated advantages in wealth building, because it allows you to stay invested when others panic. And staying invested is often what separates long-term winners from everyone else. There is also another shift that happens quietly. Opportunity begins to appear more frequently. Not because the world suddenly changes, but because your ability to participate in opportunities changes. With limited capital, many opportunities are simply out of reach. You cannot act even if you want to. But with meaningful savings, your options expand. Investments become accessible. Business opportunities become realistic. Longer-term financial decisions become possible. This is why people often say, it takes money to make money. But the truth is more precise. It takes capital to access opportunities that generate more capital. And once you reach this stage, the second $100,000 rarely feels as difficult as the first. Because now you are no longer building from zero. You are building from momentum. By the time you move past the early accumulation phase, something deeper than finances begins to change. It is not just your bank account that evolves, it is your identity. In the beginning, money decisions are emotional. Every purchase feels significant. Every saving decision requires effort. Every investment feels uncertain. You are constantly second-guessing yourself because there is no prior evidence that your system works. But once you reach your first major milestone, something fundamental shifts. You are no longer operating on hope. You are operating on proof. You have seen that consistency actually works. Patience actually compounds. Discipline actually produces results. And that realization changes your mindset permanently. You start thinking differently about time. Instead of asking, what can I get now? You begin asking, what will this become later? This is a subtle but powerful transformation. Because wealth building is not only about money, it is about delayed thinking. The ability to sacrifice immediate comfort for future advantage becomes easier, not harder, once you've experienced success. At this stage, financial decisions become less emotional and more strategic. You are no longer reacting to money, you are managing it. Another important shift is emotional stability. Early on, market fluctuations or unexpected expenses can feel stressful. A small loss can feel like a setback. A missed opportunity can feel like failure. But with experience and accumulated capital, your perspective expands. You begin to understand that volatility is not danger. It is normal behavior of financial systems. And instead of reacting impulsively, you start observing calmly. This emotional distance is critical. Because the biggest financial mistakes are rarely mathematical, they are emotional decisions made at the wrong time. As this mindset develops, something else quietly happens. You begin to detach your identity from consumption. You no longer define success by what you own or display. Instead, you start valuing what you are building. Net worth becomes more important than appearances. And this shift often puts you at odds with the people around you. Not because you have changed into someone different, but because your priorities have changed. Some people will not understand why you spend less, think longer term, say no to short-term lifestyle upgrades. But internally, you are no longer playing the same game. You are not optimizing for comfort. You are optimizing for freedom. And that difference defines everything that comes next. At this point, the logic is clear. The first $100,000 feels brutally difficult not because the system is unfair, but because you are still in the phase where everything depends on your direct effort. You are doing all the work, and the results are still too small to feel rewarding. That is why most people underestimate how long it takes and overestimate how fast progress should feel. But once you cross that early threshold, the structure begins to change. Your money starts to contribute alongside you. Compounding becomes visible. Opportunities expand. And your decision-making improves simply because you now have experience and capital working together. This is why the second $100,000 often feels easier. Not because life suddenly becomes simple, but because the system starts to support you instead of resisting you. Still, there is a deeper truth underneath everything in this entire journey. It was never really about money alone. It was about behavior. The people who eventually build wealth are not necessarily smarter, luckier, or more talented than others. They are simply more consistent in a very specific way. They make decisions that feel boring in the moment, but powerful over time. They delay gratification when others do. Stay consistent when progress feels invisible. Avoid lifestyle inflation when income increases. And keep investing even when results feel small. And over time, these small decisions compound into something large enough to change their entire life trajectory. But perhaps the most important realization is this: the struggle you feel at the beginning is not a sign that you are failing. It is a sign that you are still early. Every person who has built meaningful wealth has gone through this exact phase, the phase where effort feels high and reward feels low. The difference is not that their journey was easier. It is that they stayed in it long enough for the system to start working. And once that happens, the rules change. Not instantly, not magically, but gradually, until one day you realize you are no longer just working for money. Your money is now working with you. And that is the real turning point. So the final question is not whether the system works. It does. The question is whether you are willing to stay consistent long enough to see it work for you. Because the first $100,000 is not just a financial milestone. It is a test of behavior, patience, and identity. And once you pass it, everything that comes after starts to feel like a different game entirely.